The slap cracked across my cheek under the chandelier lights. Victoria Whitmore's diamond rings cut my skin while her son grabbed the Gala badge hanging from my neck. The room froze, but the screens behind the stage kept showing the $1 billion Port Liberty Energy deal. My badge hit the marble near the control tablet that managed Aurora's microgrid approval gateway. One swipe from that tablet could pause every interconnection permit they needed. Champagne fizzed at my shoes. Someone laughed too loudly. Then Richard Whitmore pointed at me like I was spilled wine. "Get this woman out before the signing photo," he said. That was his first real mistake. He thought the badge was access. He did not understand it was authority. The ballroom smelled of orchids, steak, and expensive perfume. A string quartet kept playing for 3 seconds longer than it should have, then died note by note. I touched my cheek. My fingers came away warm. Around us, phones lifted. Silver dresses turned. Black tuxedos shifted. Nobody stepped between Victoria and me. Not yet. She shoved past me, Victoria said, fixing her bracelet. "These people need boundaries." A few guests looked down. A few pretended to check their glasses. Ethan Whitmore bent and picked up my badge with 2 fingers, like it was dirty. "Aurora staff?" he read. "Cute. You people really print anything now." I breathed once through my nose. Slow. The cut stung. The lights made the marble look cold enough to drink from. My name was printed in small gold letters under the badge clip. He covered it with his thumb. That mattered. I am Maya Richardson. I was there because Aurora Energy owned the final operating approval for Port Liberty's private power corridor. Without our gateway, the Whitmore redevelopment would have no grid connection, no marina lighting, no electric freight access, and no emergency backup for the luxury towers they had already sold to investors. But I did not say that yet. I watched Ethan hold my badge. I watched Victoria smile for the cameras. I watched Richard signal 2 security guards near the ice sculpture. Behind Richard, the presentation loop kept glowing. Future of the East Harbor. Clean power. Community access. I had read the hidden draft that morning. The community access road was missing. The emergency flood pumps had been downgraded. The low-income housing block had been moved outside the power zone. Someone had changed the plan after Aurora's review. And now the same family wanted a public blessing under golden lights. "Apologize to my mother," Ethan said. His voice was smooth. Practiced. "Then maybe we let you keep your little job." The guards moved closer. Their shoes clicked in perfect rhythm. My badge swung from Ethan's hand. The tablet on the cocktail table dimmed, waiting for my fingerprint. I heard my own heartbeat under the silence. Not loud. Steady. Richard leaned close enough for me to smell cigar smoke on his jacket. "People like you get invited here to serve," he said. "Not to interfere." The room tightened around those words. A woman near the bar lowered her glass. An older man in a navy suit stopped smiling. Near the stage, the Whitmore attorney turned his head. His face changed first. Then his mouth opened slightly. He had seen my name before. Ethan had not. Victoria reached for my arm again. This time, I stepped back. The tablet woke beside me. My reflection appeared on its black glass, cheek marked red beneath the chandelier. Across the screen, a quiet message blinked from Aurora's operations desk. "Final approval ready. Confirm or hold." The attorney started walking fast. Then the microphone on stage came alive. I turned toward the stage just as the microphone crackled again. The sudden sound cut through the ballroom like a wire pulled tight. Conversation stopped. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the guards slowed. The attorney reached me first. A thin layer of sweat glistened beneath the lights on his forehead. "Miss Richardson," he said quietly. Not loudly. Not for the room. Just enough for the people closest to hear. Ethan's smile faded a fraction. His hand still held my badge. Victoria looked from me to the attorney and back again. For the first time all evening, uncertainty touched her face. "You know her?" Richard asked. The attorney did not answer immediately. That silence was answer enough. The giant screen behind the stage shifted to a new slide. Architectural renderings faded into aerial images of Port Liberty. Blue water. White towers. Electric ferry stations. A project that existed mostly on promises. A project that depended on power. My power. Ethan laughed once. Short. Forced. Come on. Do not tell me this is the person causing all this drama. The attorney swallowed. Ethan. What? Give her badge back. The room seemed smaller suddenly. The music had stopped completely now. Only the soft hum of air conditioning remained. I could hear ice settling inside a nearby bucket. Tiny sounds became loud when enough people stopped talking. Ethan stared at the attorney. You are serious? No answer came. His grip loosened slightly. Across the ballroom, several executives exchanged looks. Recognition moved through them one face at a time. Not everyone knew me personally. Most had only seen earnings calls, industry conferences, interviews. But some knew exactly who I was. And more importantly, what I controlled. Richard noticed the shift. Powerful people always noticed when a room changed temperature. He followed their eyes back toward me. Who exactly are you? He asked. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at the giant screen displaying his future development. Someone who read the final revision. That landed harder than I expected. The attorney closed his eyes briefly. Richard's expression tightened. Victoria folded her arms. What does that even mean? She asked. I did not answer her. Instead, I stepped toward the cocktail table. The tablet waited where I had left it. Final approval ready. Confirm or hold. The message still blinked quietly. Patient. Unemotional. Like every important decision. Ethan finally placed my badge into my hand. He tried to make it look casual. It did not work. Several guests had already noticed. I clipped it back onto my dress. The gold letters showed clearly now. Maya Richardson. A woman near the stage gasped softly. Richard saw the badge. Then he saw the name. Then he looked toward the attorney again. This time the attorney nodded once. Nothing more. Richard's face lost color. Just a little. But enough. Victoria remained confused. She had not connected the pieces yet. Richard? She asked. He ignored her. The screen changed again. Another slide appeared. Projected revenue. Investor projections. Future expansion plans. Numbers filled the ballroom walls in glowing blue. $1 billion looked impressive on a screen. It looked much smaller when you knew how fragile it really was. The attorney stepped closer to Richard. He whispered something into his ear. I could not hear the words. I did not need to. Richard's eyes widened slightly. Then he looked toward the harbor images again. Not with pride this time. With concern. Real concern. Around us, phones continued recording. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. The project was no longer the biggest story in the room. The people attached to it were. Then the master of ceremonies glanced down at a card and spoke my name again. Applause started near the stage. It spread slowly across the ballroom. Not enthusiastic. Curious. The master of ceremonies smiled toward me. Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed with tonight's signing ceremony, please welcome Aurora Energy Chief Executive Officer Maya Richardson. The words seemed to hang beneath the chandeliers. Nobody moved for a second. Then dozens of heads turned at once. Ethan's jaw tightened. Victoria blinked twice. Richard stared at me as if the room had shifted beneath his feet. I stepped away from the cocktail table. My heels clicked softly across the marble floor. The sound carried farther than it should have. Conversations vanished behind me. The giant screen glowed blue above the stage. Harbor lights reflected across the polished walls. I could still feel the sting on my cheek. I could still smell champagne on the floor. But the room no longer belonged to the Whitmores. It belonged to the truth they had failed to see. The attorney stepped aside and lowered his eyes. Richard adjusted his jacket. His hands were steady, but barely. Victoria finally found her voice. There has to be some mistake. Nobody answered her. Ethan forced a smile. Maya, right? Look, if there has been a misunderstanding. I kept walking. The sentence died behind me. A photographer lowered his camera. Another raised. Hers higher. Flashbulbs began popping near the stage. Small bursts of white light. Sharp. Constant. I climbed the steps and accepted the microphone. The ballroom stretched before me. Hundreds of faces. Investors. City officials. Developers. Reporters. Some knew exactly why Aurora mattered. Others were beginning to understand. The screen behind me changed again. Port Liberty appeared from above. Docks. Towers. Ferry terminals. Green corridors. The future they had spent years selling. I looked at the image for a moment. Then back at the audience. Good evening, I said. My voice carried cleanly through the speakers. Aurora Energy has been proud to support projects that strengthen communities and expand opportunity. A few people nodded. Pens began moving across notepads. Reporters leaned forward. Richard relaxed slightly. He thought he understood where this was going. That was another mistake. We support projects that honor their commitments. Silence settled again. I tapped the remote in my hand. A news slide appeared. 2 project maps filled the screen side by side. One approved. One revised. The differences looked small at first. Then people noticed. Missing access roads. Reduced emergency infrastructure. Relocated housing zones. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone near the back whispered a curse. Richard's face hardened. Ethan stopped smiling altogether. Victoria looked from the screen to her husband. Richard? She asked quietly. He did not answer. I continued. Aurora's review team received updated documentation this morning. More whispers. More phones lifted. The attorney closed his eyes. He already knew what came next. Richard took a step toward the stage. Then another. Security noticed. So did every camera in the room. Maya, he called out. Perhaps this discussion belongs in private. I looked directly at him. The revisions were not submitted in private. A murmur rolled through the ballroom. Low and restless. Like distant thunder. Investors exchanged worried looks. City officials checked folders. One council member pulled out a phone and began typing rapidly. The atmosphere had changed completely. This was no longer a celebration. It was becoming an examination. Richard stopped moving. He understood that much. But something else was happening. Something even he had not seen yet. My tablet vibrated in my hand. Once. Quietly. A new message had arrived from Aurora headquarters. I glanced down. The notification was only 1 sentence long. It changed everything. Then a reporter stood up from the front row. The reporter rose so quickly that his chair scraped across the floor. The sharp sound echoed through the ballroom. Every camera turned toward him. He held a tablet in one hand and a press badge in the other. Ms. Richardson, he called out. Can Aurora confirm whether the city received the same revised plans shown on that screen? The question hung in the air. Nobody spoke. I looked down at the notification still glowing on my tablet. Aurora's compliance division had completed a secondary review. That alone was unusual. They rarely moved this fast during public events. The message remained open. Additional discrepancies confirmed. I felt the weight of those 3 words immediately. Across the room, Richard Whitmore saw my expression change. He knew enough about negotiations to recognize when new information entered the room. His shoulders stiffened. Victoria looked increasingly uncomfortable. The confidence she carried earlier had started to crack. Ethan, however, was still fighting reality. This is ridiculous, he said loudly. Minor revisions happen on every project. Nobody rushed to agree with him. That silence spoke for itself. The reporter stepped forward. Were emergency flood systems reduced in the revised submission? Several city officials looked up at once. One woman near the front row lowered her glasses and stared directly at Richard. Another opened a folder and began flipping through documents. The room had stopped feeling like a celebration. It felt like an audit. I placed the tablet on the podium. The polished wood felt cool beneath my fingertips. Aurora received revisions this morning, I said. Those revisions differed from the version previously approved by our review team. More phones appeared. Tiny screens glowed throughout the ballroom. Guests were no longer recording gossip. They were recording evidence. Richard finally stepped forward again. His smile looked strained now. Maya, surely we can discuss this professionally. I met his eyes. Professional discussions require transparency. A low murmur moved through the crowd. The attorney standing near Richard looked exhausted. He knew where this was heading. He also knew it was no longer under anyone's control. Behind me, the giant screen displayed both versions of the project side by side. The differences seemed impossible to ignore now. Missing safeguards. Reduced infrastructure. Altered access routes. Every highlighted change attracted another concerned glance from the audience. Victoria approached Richard and whispered something. He answered without looking at her. Whatever he said made her face pale. For the first time that evening, she appeared genuinely worried. The ballroom lights reflected across hundreds of crystal glasses. Nobody touched them anymore. Dinner plates sat untouched on linen-covered tables. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. The entire room seemed frozen around the stage. Then another notification appeared on my tablet. This one came from Aurora's legal department. My pulse slowed rather than quickened. That always happened when decisions became clear. The message was brief. City Oversight Office requesting immediate document access. The timing was remarkable. Someone had already contacted them. News traveled fast when powerful people started asking questions. Richard noticed me reading. What is it? He asked before he could stop himself. The question escaped too quickly. Too openly. Several reporters immediately wrote it down. I almost answered. Then I stopped. Sometimes silence revealed more than words. The reporters sensed it too. Pens moved faster. Cameras zoomed closer. Ethan looked toward the exits for the first time all night. That small movement did not go unnoticed. Neither did the council member quietly stepping away from her table while speaking into her phone. The project was beginning to develop problems far beyond Aurora's approval process. Then the ballroom doors opened and 3 unexpected visitors walked inside. 3 people entered through the ballroom doors wearing dark city identification badges. They were not dressed for a gala. No tuxedos. No evening gowns. Just business attire and serious expressions. The change in the room was immediate. Conversations that had barely recovered fell silent again. One of the reporters turned so quickly that he nearly dropped his phone. The council member near the front row lowered hers and stared toward the entrance. Richard Whitmore followed every eye in the room. His jaw tightened. He recognized them. That much was obvious. The lead official carried a slim black portfolio under her arm. She walked with calm purpose. Not rushed. Not hesitant. The kind of pace people used when they already knew why they were there. The ballroom lights reflected across the polished floor as she approached the stage. Behind me, the project maps still filled the giant screen. The differences remained visible to everyone. Nobody could pretend otherwise anymore. The official stopped several feet from the stage and looked up. Ms. Richardson, she said. We appreciate your cooperation. A ripple moved through the audience. Cameras shifted toward her. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Richard stepped forward before I could answer. This is highly irregular, he said. We can schedule a meeting during normal business hours. The official turned toward him. Her expression did not change. Mr. Whitmore, we attempted that. The answer landed heavily. Even Ethan looked uncomfortable. Victoria gripped the edge of a nearby table. Crystal glasses rattled softly against each other. The official opened her portfolio. Paper slid against paper. Small sounds suddenly seemed enormous. Earlier today, she continued, our office received multiple requests regarding revised infrastructure submissions connected to Port Liberty. Nobody interrupted her. Not even Richard. The audience was listening too closely now. Investors leaned forward. Reporters moved closer to the stage. I could hear camera shutters clicking every few seconds. The official removed a document and handed it to one of her colleagues. Several discrepancies require immediate review. A second official began, distributing copies to city representatives seated near the front. The moment those papers appeared, the atmosphere changed again. This was no longer speculation. It was procedure. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. His confidence had faded steadily throughout the evening. Now it seemed to disappear altogether. He looked toward his father. Richard offered nothing back. No reassurance. No strategy. No answers. I glanced down at my tablet. New messages continued arriving from Aurora headquarters. Compliance teams. Legal teams. Risk analysts. Everyone had realized the same thing. The situation was accelerating. Fast. One message stood out. Investor calls beginning. Expect market reaction by morning. I locked the screen. There was no need to share that yet. Across the ballroom, a woman representing one of the major investment groups quietly stood from her table. She gathered her folder. Then another executive followed. Then another. Nobody announced their departure. They simply started creating distance. Richard noticed. That worried him more than anything said on stage. Money rarely waited for certainty. It moved at the first sign of risk. Victoria watched the exits. Her face looked pale beneath the warm chandelier glow. This cannot be happening, she whispered. But it was. The giant screen behind me shifted automatically to the next slide in the presentation. Future revenue forecasts appeared in bright blue numbers. Earlier those numbers had inspired excitement. Now they looked fragile. Temporary. The lead official glanced at the screen, and then back at Richard. We will need access to all submitted revisions immediately. Richard opened his mouth. Closed it. Then opened it again. No words came out. Around him, dozens of phones continued recording. Every expression. Every reaction. Every second. Then the attorney who had recognized me earlier slowly stood from his chair and cleared his throat. The attorney adjusted his tie before speaking. The movement looked small, but everyone noticed it. He had spent most of the evening standing behind Richard Whitmore. Now he seemed to be creating distance. The ballroom lights reflected across his glasses as he stepped into the open space near the stage. There is something the room should understand, he said carefully. His voice carried farther than expected. Reporters immediately lifted their phones higher. Several investors stopped walking toward the exits. They wanted to hear this. Richard looked at him sharply. A warning flashed across his face. The attorney ignored it. That alone told me how serious the situation had become. Aurora Energy's approval was not a formality, he continued. It was a required operational gateway. A murmur moved through the crowd. Some people already knew that. Others were hearing it for the first time. The attorney glanced toward the giant screen. Without Aurora's authorization, the energy corridor cannot be activated. Without activation, major portions of the project cannot operate as proposed. Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that settles when people start doing math in their heads. Investors exchanged looks. A banker near the front table lowered his champagne glass without taking a sip. Ethan stared at the attorney. Why are you saying this? He demanded. The attorney looked tired. Older somehow. Because everyone here is about to find out anyway. Cameras clicked. Pens scratched across paper. The city officials remained perfectly still. Their expressions revealed nothing. I watched Richard carefully. He was no longer focused on me. He was calculating, searching for a path back to control. People like Richard always believed there was another move available. Another call. Another favor. Another negotiation. But some systems did not work that way. Electricity did not care about influence. Compliance reviews did not care about reputation. Neither did public records. The attorney continued. Aurora controls final activation authority for the microgrid network supporting Port Liberty's commercial infrastructure. More whispers. More concerned looks. A reporter near the aisle immediately began typing. Another walked toward the back of the ballroom to make a call. News was already escaping the room. I could almost feel it spreading beyond the building. Across financial desks. Newsrooms. City offices. The giant screen behind me still displayed projected revenue numbers. They looked almost surreal now. Bright promises floating above a room full of uncertainty. Victoria took a slow breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her bracelet. Earlier she had looked untouchable. Now she looked lost. "Richard," she whispered. "Tell me this can be fixed." He did not answer. That frightened her more than anything else. My tablet vibrated again. I glanced down briefly. Another update from Aurora. Market analysts requesting comment. Preliminary concerns emerging. The reaction had begun faster than expected. I placed the tablet face down. Across the ballroom, one investor quietly gathered his documents and left. Then another followed. Neither announced their departure. They simply walked away. The movement spread. Small at first. Then noticeable. Chairs shifted. Jackets were collected. Conversations became private. The energy in the room was changing direction. Not toward celebration. Away from risk. Ethan saw it too. His confidence finally cracked. "They are overreacting," he said. Nobody responded. The absence of support hit harder than any argument. The lead city official closed her portfolio and looked toward me. "Ms. Richardson, has Aurora reached a final decision regarding authorization status?" Hundreds of eyes turned toward the stage. The room became completely still. Even the air seemed quieter. I looked at the notification waiting on my tablet. Then I looked at the project displayed behind me. One answer would change everything. Then a new voice spoke from the back of the ballroom. The voice came from near the ballroom entrance. Calm. Clear. Impossible to ignore. Everyone turned at once. A gray-haired woman stood beside the doors holding a thin folder against her side. She was not a reporter. She was not an investor. She was someone many people in the room recognized immediately. The reaction spread faster than whispers. Several city officials straightened in their seats. One investor who had been halfway to the exit stopped walking. Richard Whitmore looked toward her and seemed to lose whatever confidence he had left. The woman stepped forward. Her shoes clicked softly across the marble floor. "I believe I can answer that question," she said. The lead city official nodded respectfully. That told the room everything it needed to know. This woman carried influence. Real influence. Not the kind purchased through donations or social connections. The kind built through decades of public trust. She approached the stage slowly. The chandeliers reflected across the polished folder in her hands. I recognized her immediately. Judge Eleanor Grant. Former State Ethics Commissioner. Current chair of the Independent Infrastructure Oversight Board. Her presence alone changed the atmosphere. Reporters began moving closer. Camera flashes returned. The room felt tighter now. Smaller somehow. Judge Grant stopped a few feet from the stage and looked directly at Richard. "Your company submitted additional revisions 48 hours ago," she said. Richard remained silent. "Those revisions triggered an automatic review." A low murmur rolled through the ballroom. Ethan looked confused. Victoria looked frightened. The judge opened her folder. Paper rustled softly. Tiny sounds carried easily in the silence. Several reviewers expressed concern regarding the removal of critical public access protections. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Additional concerns involved emergency infrastructure modifications and service priority adjustments. The giant screen behind me still displayed the project maps. Every highlighted change now seemed brighter than before. More obvious. More difficult to explain away. Richard finally spoke. Judge Grant, with respect, our team intended to address those items during final negotiations. The judge studied him for a moment. Her expression never changed. Then your team should have disclosed them during final negotiations. A few investors lowered their eyes. Others quietly checked their phones. News alerts were already beginning to appear. I could see screens lighting up throughout the ballroom. Notifications. Headlines. Questions. The story had escaped the room completely now. My tablet vibrated again. Another update from Aurora. Media requests increasing. Market watch list activated. I placed the device beside the podium and folded my hands. There was nothing left to rush. The truth was moving on its own. Across the ballroom, Ethan suddenly stepped forward. "This is becoming a public trial," he said. "Nobody has proven wrongdoing." His voice sounded louder than he intended. A few guests winced. The judge turned toward him. "Nobody said wrongdoing." The answer landed heavily. Ethan immediately realized his mistake. The room noticed too. The silence afterward felt longer than it was. Victoria looked toward her son, then toward Richard. Neither man offered reassurance. Neither seemed capable of it. The confidence that had filled their table earlier was gone. In its place sat uncertainty. Doubt. Calculation. The lead city official glanced back toward me. "Ms. Richardson," she said, "Aurora's authorization status remains the central issue." Hundreds of eyes returned to the stage. The ballroom became still once more. I could hear the distant hum of ventilation above the chandeliers. I could smell cooling food from tables nobody touched anymore. Investors waited. Reporters waited. City officials waited. Even Richard Whitmore waited. I reached for the tablet. The authorization screen remained open. Two options glowed quietly beneath Aurora's logo. One would move the project forward. The other would stop everything. Then Richard took a step toward the stage and said something nobody expected. Richard Whitmore stopped near the front of the stage and lowered his voice. The sudden change caught everyone off guard. For the first time that night, he did not sound like the most powerful man in the room. He sounded like someone trying to prevent a disaster. "Maya," he said, looking directly at me. "Let us fix this." The ballroom became perfectly still. Even the reporters stopped moving. The words hung beneath the chandeliers like suspended glass. Nobody expected them. Not from him. Not here. Victoria stared at her husband in disbelief. Ethan looked even more shocked. Richard had spent the entire evening defending every decision. Now he was asking for a second chance in front of hundreds of witnesses. I watched him carefully. The red mark on my cheek had faded slightly beneath the warm lights. The memory had not. Neither had the sequence of events that followed. The insults. The assumptions. The revisions hidden inside the project documents. The quiet confidence that nobody important would notice. Richard took another step forward. "Whatever concerns exist, we can address them." His voice remained controlled, but something underneath it had changed. Urgency. Real urgency. Judge Grant folded her arms and said nothing. The city officials remained silent. They wanted to hear my answer. So did everyone else. The giant screen behind me still displayed the authorization portal. Two choices. Approve. Hold. Such simple words for decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. My tablet rested beside the podium. The screen glowed softly. More notifications continued arriving. Investors. Journalists. Board members. Questions from every direction. The story was expanding beyond the ballroom walls. Fast. A camera flash burst from the center of the room. Then another. The light reflected across crystal glasses and polished silverware. Nobody had touched dinner in nearly an hour. The food sat cooling beneath decorative covers. Forgotten. Victoria finally stepped forward. Her voice was smaller now. We can work this out. The room noticed the difference immediately. Earlier she had spoken with certainty. Now she sounded uncertain herself. That shift carried weight. People remembered confidence. They remembered when it disappeared too. I looked toward the audience. Investors watched from their tables. Reporters waited with notebooks ready. Public officials studied every expression. Some faces looked concerned. Others looked fascinated. A few looked relieved. One thing united all of them. Nobody believed this was a private conversation anymore. Ethan suddenly moved closer to his father. We should not be doing this here, he muttered. Unfortunately for him, microphones are very good at finding tension. Several reporters immediately wrote the sentence down. Richard ignored him. His attention remained fixed on me. Aurora and Whitmore Development have worked together before, he said. We can find a path forward. The statement sounded reasonable, professional, measured. But there was a problem. It ignored the real issue. The issue was not paperwork. It was trust. Trust powered projects just as surely as electricity powered buildings. Once damaged, it was not easily restored. Judge Grant seemed to recognize that. Her expression softened slightly, though not toward Richard. Toward the process itself. Toward accountability. I picked up the tablet. The ballroom followed the movement. Hundreds of eyes tracking one simple action. The authorization portal filled the screen. The blue light illuminated my fingertips. Silence settled across the room once again. I could hear someone setting down a glass near the back wall. The sound seemed unusually loud. Richard held his breath. Victoria looked at the floor. Ethan stared at the exits. The city officials waited. The investors waited. Everyone waited. Then I looked up and asked a question nobody in the room was prepared to answer. The question left my mouth and settled over the ballroom like a weight. What exactly am I supposed to trust? Nobody answered immediately. The silence felt different this time. Not tense. Honest. Richard stood motionless near the stage. The confidence that had carried him through boardrooms, negotiations, and public appearances seemed far away now. The giant screen behind me continued to glow blue. Project maps. Revenue projections. Future promises. All of it remained visible. All of it suddenly looked fragile. Richard opened his mouth once. Then closed it again. He understood the problem. This was no longer about technical revisions or delayed approvals. It was about judgment. About choices. About what people revealed when they believed power protected them. The ballroom lights reflected off hundreds of watching eyes. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Judge Grant remained perfectly still. The city officials waited. Investors watched carefully from their tables. Even the reporters had stopped shouting questions. They wanted an answer. A real one. Victoria lowered herself into a chair near the front row. The movement looked small, but it drew attention. Earlier she had dominated every conversation around her. Now she seemed exhausted. Ethan paced 2 steps. Away from his father. Then stopped. Then paced back again. His frustration showed in every movement. We already said we can fix it, he said. His voice echoed slightly through the room. I looked at him. You are talking about documents. The words came out calm. Clear. I am talking about decisions. Several people nodded. A few investors exchanged glances. They understood the distinction immediately. One involved paperwork. The other involved character. Richard finally spoke. You are right. The admission surprised everyone. A reporter actually lowered his phone for a second. Across the ballroom, someone quietly exhaled. Richard looked older than he had an hour earlier. Not physically. Just tired. worn down by reality. "We should have disclosed the revisions," he said. "We should have brought them forward directly." Judge Grant watched him carefully. So did the city officials. Nobody rushed to reward the admission. Accountability was not a coupon. It did not erase consequences. Richard seemed to understand that. "And what happened before tonight?" I asked. The room tightened again. Victoria stared at the floor. Ethan looked away. The question was simple. Everyone knew what it meant. The ballroom suddenly felt smaller. The memory still sat there between us. Public. Visible. Impossible to edit out of the evening. Richard glanced briefly toward Victoria. Then back at me. "That should never have happened." The answer came quietly. Cameras captured every second. Flashbulbs burst across the room. Reporters scribbled notes. Investors listened. Not because of the apology itself. Because of what it represented. The balance of power had changed. Completely. My tablet vibrated again. Another update appeared on the screen. Market opening forecast updated. Risk exposure increasing. The consequences were already moving beyond the ballroom. Beyond the city. Beyond any single decision made tonight. I placed the tablet down once more. The room followed the motion automatically. Everyone knew the authorization portal remained open. Waiting. Judge Grant stepped slightly closer to the stage. "Ms. Richardson," she said, "the board will respect Aurora's determination." That statement carried enormous weight. It was not pressure. It was recognition. The decision belonged to Aurora. To me. Hundreds of people waited. The chandeliers hummed softly overhead. Cooling foods sat untouched. Cameras remained raised. Richard Whitmore stood perfectly still. Then the tablet screen changed on its own. The glow on the tablet shifted from blue to amber. The change was subtle, but everyone saw it. The authorization portal disappeared. A new screen replaced it. Review status updated. Additional findings attached. A murmur spread through the ballroom. Richard stared at the screen. His expression tightened immediately. Judge Grant stepped closer. The city officials exchanged quick looks. Reporters lifted their phones higher. Another update had arrived. That meant the story was still growing. It was not finished yet. I opened the attachment. The ballroom remained silent except for the faint hum of the ventilation system above us. Crystal glasses reflected the amber light from the tablet. Several investors had stopped pretending to check their messages. They were openly watching now. The first page loaded. Then the second. Then the third. Each one added another layer to the picture. Not dramatic revelations. Not hidden conspiracies. Something more dangerous. Patterns. Consistent patterns. Infrastructure reductions. Cost-saving substitutions. Delayed disclosures. Small decisions repeated often enough to become a problem. I looked up from the screen. Richard already knew. He could tell from my face. "What is it?" Ethan asked. His voice cracked slightly. Nobody answered him immediately. The room had learned patience. The reporters especially. They knew the next few minutes mattered. Judge Grant adjusted her glasses. "Ms. Richardson?" she asked. I turned the tablet slightly so the nearest city officials could see. Their expressions changed one after another. A transportation advisor frowned. A planning director leaned closer. The lead official exhaled slowly through her nose. None of them looked surprised. Concerned, yes. Surprised, no. That detail caught my attention. These findings connected to something larger. Richard noticed it too. "How long have they been reviewing this?" he asked. The lead official folded her hands. "Long enough." The answer landed heavily. Across the ballroom, another investor quietly left his table. Then a second followed. The movement continued like a tide pulling away from shore. Nobody wanted to be associated with uncertainty. Especially public uncertainty. The giant screen behind me remained frozen on the project overview. Bright towers. Clean waterfronts. Happy families walking along illuminated paths. The promotional images felt disconnected from reality now. Too polished. Too perfect. Victoria stared at the floor. She had stopped trying to influence the conversation. Stopped trying to control it. Her silence said more than her words ever had. I glanced again at the report. One section stood out. Community access obligations. Several revisions had reduced public protections without clearly identifying the changes. Legal. Technically. Perhaps. But trust was rarely built on technicalities. Richard rubbed his forehead. The gesture looked tired. Human. For the first time all evening, he seemed less like a developer and more like a man realizing how much had slipped beyond his control. Can we correct it? He asked quietly. The question surprised the room. Not because of the words. Because of the tone. No confidence. No pressure. Just a question. Judge Grant studied him for a moment. That depends on whether correction is still the issue. Silence followed. The statement lingered. Everyone understood what she meant. This was no longer only about plans. It was about judgment. Credibility. Accountability. My tablet vibrated once more. A final notification appeared at the top of the screen. This one came directly from Aurora's board of directors. I opened it and read the first sentence. Then I looked toward the audience. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. One sentence had changed the decision completely. Then I set the tablet on the podium and reached for the microphone. The microphone felt cool in my hand. The ballroom had never been quieter. Hundreds of people watched from beneath the chandelier light. Investors. Officials. Reporters. The Whitmore family. Every eye seemed fixed on the stage. I looked down at the message from Aurora's board one final time. Then I locked the screen. The decision was no longer a question. It was a responsibility. I raised the microphone. A few minutes ago, I said, Aurora's board completed an emergency review of today's findings. The words echoed softly through the room. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Richard Whitmore stood with his hands at his sides. He looked tired now. Not defeated. Just tired. The kind of tired that comes when certainty finally disappears. Victoria sat motionless near the front row. Ethan stared at the giant screen behind me. The bright images of Port Liberty still glowed above us. Towers. Walkways. Waterfront lights. Promises. I continued. Aurora believes successful projects require more than investment. Several reporters leaned forward. Pens moved. Camera lights blinked red. They require transparency, accountability, and trust. A few heads nodded throughout the room. Judge Grant remained still. The city officials listened carefully. Richard lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back toward the stage. He understood where this was going. Everyone did. The only question was how far. I rested one hand against the podium. The polished wood felt smooth beneath my fingertips. Tonight is not about punishment, I said. It is about responsibility. The room remained silent. Earlier in the evening, that silence had felt hostile. Now it felt reflective. Thoughtful. Even the reporters seemed less interested in conflict than in the answer itself. Ethan shook his head. So what happens now? He asked. His voice carried farther than he intended. I looked toward him. Now people tell the truth. The answer settled over the ballroom. No dramatic reaction followed. Just understanding. The kind that arrives slowly and stays. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. Richard exhaled through his nose. The attorney who had first recognized me looked relieved. Not happy. Relieved. There was a difference. My tablet vibrated once. Then again. More updates. More questions. More consequences unfolding outside the building. But those could wait. This moment belonged here. Judge Grant stepped closer. To the stage. Ms. Richardson, she said, has Aurora reached its determination? The question returned everyone to the same point. The same decision. The same glowing portal that had dominated the evening. I picked up the tablet. The amber screen illuminated my hands. The authorization status remained open. Waiting. I could hear the faint hum of the ballroom lights overhead. I could smell cooling coffee from a nearby service station. Tiny details suddenly felt sharp. Clear. Real. Richard took a slow breath. Whatever your decision is, he said quietly, we will accept it. Several people turned toward him. The statement surprised them. It surprised Ethan too. His shoulders dropped slightly. For the first time all night, nobody was arguing. Nobody was trying to control the room. The truth had already done that. I looked at the authorization screen one final time. Then I pressed a button. The tablet chimed softly. A new status appeared immediately. Several city officials leaned forward to read it. Judge Grant's eyes narrowed slightly. Richard stared without blinking. Then the giant screen behind me changed. The giant screen flickered once before the new status appeared. The bright project renderings vanished. The waterfront towers disappeared. The glowing revenue projections dissolved into a simple notice displayed in white letters against a dark background. Authorization status. On hold pending compliance review. The ballroom did not react immediately. For a brief second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if the entire room needed time to understand what those words actually meant. Then the whispers began. Soft at first. Then spreading table by table. Investors leaned toward one another. Reporters checked their screens. City officials exchanged measured looks. The decision was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was procedural. That made it far more powerful. I lowered the tablet and stepped away from the podium. The amber glow faded from my hands. Richard Whitmore stared at the screen without blinking. He had spent years building the project. Years raising capital. Years shaping public support. And now everything depended on questions that should have been answered long before tonight. Victoria remained seated. Her shoulders seemed smaller somehow. The confidence that had filled her voice earlier was gone. Ethan looked toward the giant screen and then toward me. For the first time all evening, he did not have an argument ready. Judge Grant nodded once. Not approval. Recognition. The process had been allowed to work. That mattered. The lead city official closed her portfolio. The review will proceed immediately, she said. Her voice carried clearly through the ballroom. Several reporters typed the statement word for word. One camera crew near the back quietly packed away a lighting stand. The story had changed. It was no longer about a glamorous development project. It was about accountability. I glanced around the room. Crystal glasses still reflected the chandelier light. Dinner plates remained untouched. Half-finished conversations hung in the air like remnants of another evening entirely. Everything looked the same. Yet nothing felt the same. Richard finally looked away from the screen. His gaze found me across the stage. There was disappointment there. Frustration too. But something else had appeared. Understanding. Not complete. Not comfortable. Just enough to matter. He took a slow breath. You could have ended it tonight, he said quietly. Several people nearby heard him. The reporters certainly did. I met his eyes. That was never the goal. Silence followed. A different kind of silence. Not tense. Not hostile. Reflective. Judge Grant watched the exchange without interruption. Ethan lowered his head. Victoria looked out across the ballroom. Neither seemed interested in defending anything anymore. The evening had moved beyond defense. My tablet vibrated once more. Another update from Aurora's board. Market analysts had already begun revising projections. Investors were requesting meetings. Questions were multiplying. The consequences would continue long after the ballroom emptied. But those consequences would belong to tomorrow. Tonight belonged to choices. To moments. to the small decisions that eventually become large outcomes. I slipped the tablet into my portfolio. Around the room, guests slowly began standing from their tables. Some headed toward the exits. Others remained where they were, discussing what they had witnessed. The giant screen continued displaying the review notice. Bright. Unavoidable. Then Richard Whitmore took one final step toward the stage. Richard Whitmore stopped at the base of the stage and looked up at me. The ballroom had begun to empty, but nobody close enough to hear walked away. Reporters lingered near the aisles. Investors remained beside their tables. City officials stood in small groups beneath the chandeliers. The evening was ending, yet something important still remained unfinished. Richard adjusted his jacket slowly. Not because he needed to. Because he was searching for the right words. Earlier that night, words had come easily to him. Confidence had supplied them. Now he seemed determined not to waste any. "I spent years building projects," he said quietly. "I thought results were all that mattered." The room listened. Nobody interrupted. Even the reporters lowered their phones slightly. Richard glanced toward the giant screen. The review notice still glowed above the ballroom. Simple. Clear. Unavoidable. "Somewhere along the way," he continued, "I stopped paying attention to how those results were achieved." Victoria sat silently a few feet away. Ethan stood beside her. Neither attempted to speak. Neither tried to change the moment. They simply listened. Judge Grant remained near the stage. Her expression revealed little, but her presence carried weight. She understood what many people in the room were beginning to understand. Accountability was not only about consequences. It was also about recognition. About finally seeing what should have been obvious much earlier. Richard looked directly at me. The pride that had defined him throughout the evening was gone. "You deserved better tonight." The words settled gently into the silence. No dramatic reaction followed. No applause. No speeches. Just honesty. Sometimes that carried farther. I nodded once. Nothing more. There was no need for a larger response. The ballroom had already witnessed enough. Across the room, staff members quietly began collecting untouched plates. Silverware clinked softly against serving trays. The scent of cooling food mixed with expensive perfume and fresh flowers. The event was returning to reality. Ordinary sounds were reclaiming the space. My tablet remained inside my portfolio. New messages continued arriving. Investors requesting meetings. Journalists requesting statements. Board members discussing next steps. Tomorrow would be busy. But tomorrow could wait. Tonight had delivered its own lesson. Ethan finally stepped forward. His voice was lower than before. "I should have listened." The admission seemed difficult for him. That made it meaningful. Victoria looked toward me as well. Her eyes settled briefly on the place where the evening had started. Then she lowered her gaze. No excuses followed. No explanations. Just silence. Sometimes silence revealed growth more clearly than words. Judge Grant smiled faintly. Not because anyone had won. Because something rare had happened. People had stopped defending themselves long enough to learn something. The giant screen dimmed slightly as the ballroom lighting shifted into closing mode. The bright review notice faded into the background. Guests continued filing toward the exits. Conversation softened. The tension that had dominated the evening slowly dissolved. I turned toward the stage steps. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor. Behind me, the room continued moving forward. Ahead of me, the doors stood open beneath the warm glow of the lobby lights. I paused once and looked back. Richard stood beside his family. The investors were gone. The cameras were lowering. The ballroom felt smaller now. More human. Then I walked toward the exit, leaving the lesson behind for everyone else to carry.